right. Thank you, Travis. And keep that young part coming. I really enjoyed that part of the introduction. And Sarah and I are going to sit since we're tag teaming this presentation. And with that, I am super excited to be here this morning and really pleased to be talking a little bit about the Texas legislature. And just like it's always sunny in Philadelphia, it is always a water session in Texas.
All right, so I'm going to kick this off here. First, TWCA, our name is the Texas Water Conservation Association. This is who I work for. The word conservation tends to throw people because in this day and age, when people hear the word conservation, they think about, restricting water use, either through high efficiency toilets or, restrictions on lawn watering. But when we were formed in 1944, it meant damming up a river to conserve water for water supply to keep it from running off into the Gulf. And so the connotation of that word has certainly changed, and we're actually considering, our board is considering dropping the word conservation from our name because we essentially are the Texas Water Association. You can see up here the diversity of our membership, the different types of water districts. Pretty much every different type of water district is there. Now, certainly the biggest portion of our membership is water and wastewater providers. TWCA members provide water and wastewater to the vast majority of the state, but you certainly have all the different facets of dealing with water management from drought to flood. And so that's who we are. And I'll kick it over to Julie to talk through.
Sure thing. And okay. All right. Well, just to introduce our organization, I'm the executive director of the Water Environment Association of Texas, and we represent the clean water professionals in Texas. And when I say clean water, I'm hearkening back to the Clean Water Act. So typically, in everyday conversation, we're known as the wastewater professionals, but what we produce is clean water at the end of the day, or at least that is the goal. And so that's where the clean water professionals really comes in. We're made up of attorneys, engineers, operators, plant managers, utility directors, elected officials, again, all of those clean water professionals across Texas. We're about 4,200 strong, and we really focus on education, engagement, and advocacy. And rolling into the legislative session, so the 88th legislative session, just wanted to look at the bill passage rate and the number of bills filed. As you can see, we were at an all-time high in the 88th. Some of that is due to the complexity of our state and the issues that we're grappling with, also due to a little bit of the hangover of the pandemic and some additional filings post-pandemic session. And it felt like, as Sarah and I were running around the Capitol, that bills were just dying left and right as the session ended, and a ton of bills were vetoed as well. But in fact, the passage rate is about the same, or was about the same in the 88th as compared to other legislative sessions. And I believe I have a 16% passage rate there on the screen. Next slide.
So getting a little bit deeper, sometimes it's fun to look at other numbers because it starts to tell you a story about what's really going on, right? So the first piece is that the House passed twice as many bills as the Senate. So that tells you a little bit about the amount of activity that's going on in the House versus the Senate. Also, some statistics about the number of bills that die without a hearing. Certainly, the majority of bills die at the very beginning of the process before it ever even gets to its first public hearing. More so in the Senate than the House, but that's not surprising. There are fewer of them in the Senate, and so the workload's just a little bit tougher there. But that also goes to some stats here about what happened in terms of the House and the Senate. So the House passed 63% of the Senate bills that came over from the Senate to the House. But going the other direction, the Senate only passed about 48% of the bills sent from the House. And so that's another piece of data there that's telling you a story about how much work is happening in the House versus the Senate. Now, it's always a little bit lower. You have in the Senate, because there are fewer of them, because of the workload issues, a lot of times they will combine multiple bills into one bill. And so that's a piece of that story. But compared to the previous session, it really tells you how much of a difference it was that the House in the previous session passed 74% of Senate bills and Senate passed 93% of House bills. So a lot of a very different story from the previous session.
Thanks, Sarah. And she's absolutely right. What we're going to do is tell a few stories and separate stories that weave together and really tell the 88th, the interim, and what the feeling or vibe is as we're leading to the 89th. And so what were the big wins out of the 88th? Well, the Texas Water Fund, which was, of course, that $1 billion that was voted on and passed in Senate Bill 28. And we have the sunset and the three key agencies that deal with water, of course, the TCEQ, Texas Water Development Board, and PUC, all live to fight another 12 years under the same name and similar iteration. And of course, Nathan did mention a few outcomes of the sunset process that we can dive into if there are any questions on that. But essentially, all were given the green light to continue for another 12 years until their number is called once again and they come under sunset review. And water infrastructure. Within that Texas Water Fund, a big piece of that $1 billion is focused on water infrastructure, increasing new water, and then also infrastructure investment. So we'll dive a little deeper later on. And then licensing requirements. This was a fairly small arcane bill, but it does have huge implications, we hope, for the workforce, the water workforce in Texas, which, of course, the water is only as good as the folks that are at the plant managing it and actually operating that plant. So we're excited to see that big win with licensure in Texas. And banging the infrastructure drum. So diving a little deeper into kind of the general context that the 88th was set against, or really the backdrop. So we had Abbott's State of the State address, where he did mention infrastructure as one of his top 7 priorities. We had the Senate Water Ag Rural Affairs interim report that mentioned water infrastructure throughout, so we knew it was becoming a big theme. Then, of course, the Sunset Self-Review and Legislative Appropriation Requests, the LARs. So TCQ, Texas Water Development Board, mentioned physical infrastructure and human capital or human infrastructure as well, and needing funding to address deficits there. And then, of course, the general backdrop. So if you think back a bit, we had the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis. We had similar water crises that didn't make as big of a headline nationally in Louisiana. And then we had boil water notices across Texas, and I believe it was 2,000 plus that year leading into the 88th. And then we had wastewater consent decrees, 4 in Texas alone, which is an incredible number, and water quality, supply general anxiety, and of course, supply chain disruption and workers' strikes. So there was big focus and emphasis on water infrastructure, and the humans that are helping to make everything work. And then, of course, coupled with all that was the creation of the first House Water Caucus, which was super exciting to see. We had, I believe, 70 plus legislators sign on, lots of interest there. And it really was developed to address an educational need amongst our lawmakers, right? So that going into committee hearings, they would be a little bit more well-versed in the background of water issues to then be able to vote accordingly and understand what was put in front of them.
I'll add, it's really nice to see so many of the House. It's essentially half of the House who signed up for this in its very first session, which tells you a lot of people understand how important water is, even if maybe they don't have the very deep technical understandings. They're still understanding how important this issue is to their communities.
That's right. And chaired by Chairman King, or led by Chairman King in the House. I think was a really important key to bringing on a lot of legislatures. He's seen as a major water thinker and water doer. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our Water Infrastructure Coalition slash support group. So this was a group of water organizations in Texas and some non-water organizations that came together to really talk about Senate Bill 28 and the other water bills and make sure we were sharing information. We were singing from the same hymnal and really on the same page around these bills so that when we came in, there weren't separate water organizations saying separate things, but we were all coming in really re-emphasizing each other's talking points. And again, another contributing factor to a big water session was the budget surplus. So we walked into the 88th really boasting, and at the time it was considered a $34 billion surplus. I know that number adjusted up as the year unfolded, but that was a historic budget surplus. Of course, there were other groups trying to bite at that apple, and 10 billion of that was directed to transportation needs. And so we knew that we were walking with at least $25 billion of money that groups were grabbing at, including water. And so we had the Water Caucus, that drumbeat of infrastructure investment, the budget surplus, water. So where did water infrastructure funding land? And you see on the screen, that's a picture of Eeyore. If you think back to, Pooh and Eeyore, kind of signifies where we were at the end of Senate Bill 28 and really how this all unraveled. We were happy for what we got, but man, we wanted more, especially with all of those factors contributing to what we thought could be a huge, incredible water session. And just to go over some of the highlights, and not to be a major Eeyore, because I think the quote on the top of the screen really says it all. And I believe that was in an op-ed published by Vanessa Puig Williams. But it says, Texas has made a generational investment in water this year, one that we know isn't enough. So, both things can be true, right? It was a generational investment. It was enormous. We've got to celebrate the win. And it's not nearly enough in Texas for our vast water needs. But what did we get? Well, the $1 billion Texas Water Fund, $625 million to the Flood Infrastructure Fund, 5.5 or 550 million Coastal Barrier, 125 million SRF matching so that we can draw down on that federal money, and then 3 million to Rural Tech Assistance, and a few other millions sprinkled here and there.
I'll add here, just because Nathan had mentioned water availability models, some of the things you didn't see funded was an investment in science. Science is a really important pillar when you're talking about water because of its technical nature. So, he explained that water availability models are how TCEQ decides whether to grant another water right. And in some places, like the Nueces Basin, the water availability model is outdated. It's from the late 90s. And since that time, there has been at least one drought of record in the basin, and that's not being reflected. And so one of the risks of having outdated science informing your decision making is that you might over appropriate those water rights. And that's why it's so important, and we'll be beating the drum again next cycle to get that funded.
That's right. And I know Sarah's organization, TWCA, was a huge proponent of that WAMS bill that came up that was ultimately passed, but like she said, not funded. So, those unfunded mandates don't go too far. All right. So just outlining the Texas Water Fund. So looking at that $1 billion that we did get, a portion of it was dedicated to new water, so new water supply fund. And Sarah will jump in and dive in a little bit deeper on this, but those are just kind of the basics on the screen and how the Texas Water Development Board is being asked to distribute it. And they have some broad authority with that, but then there's some also nuances in the bill where you focus on small rural and of course at least 1/4 of that billion is going to be focused on new water supply development.
So switching gears to post session, the way that the legislature passed this legislation is that it had a constitutional amendment that had to be presented to voters to establish the Texas Water Fund. And if established, then it would trigger a $1 billion appropriation. So that went to the voters in November and was passed. But it was certainly a long summer and fall of collaboratively working. Julie mentioned all the work of the water associations working together on this. That's a new thing. That's really great. But water entities generally don't have a lot of money. It's a lot of public sector entities that are providing water, wastewater, stormwater services. So we teamed up with a lot of industry groups. So Texas Oil and Gas Association, the builders, the realtors, Chemical Council, some of these folks with definite investments in water, that support this industry, and worked with them to market a broad coalition of infrastructure investments. So Propositions 6, 7, and 8. So that was water, that was energy, and that was broadband. So it was really great to see that teamwork, and I think that's part of why you saw that pay off. Now, diving a little bit deeper into what did we pass and how is it going to work? So you can see here that it kind of works as an umbrella fund. Because the voters voted to establish the Texas Water Fund, and that $1 billion appropriation essentially goes into that top red box, and then from there can be spread into all of the boxes below, which represent most of the Water Development Board's financial assistance programs to communities to help them improve their water and wastewater infrastructure needs. The red ones are new ones that were established by the legislation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what this new water supply fund is. And then, of course, there's a little bit more money too for a statewide public awareness campaign. So they're in the process of working that out as well. But I thought that visual was helpful to sort of see where it's going to go. And then now we're going to talk about what the legislation specifically says on what it should be used for. So there's a couple of priorities here. The first is for rural and small communities with populations under 150,000. This is a huge need in Texas. When you think back historically to how water and wastewater systems were established, there was a lot of federal money that came in. And so, especially in smaller communities, there were grants from the federal government to get a lot of these things in place. Those ended, and now the federal government only provides some amount of loan funding that is on the decrease, especially in Texas. So you're seeing those systems that were put in place really reach the end of their useful life right now. And so that's why we're in the water infrastructure issues that we have. And in the smaller communities, as many of you probably well know, it's very difficult because less resources, people wearing multiple hats. And so sometimes it's hard to do the additional planning and the engineering and project management needed to really make these infrastructure investments. So there's additional money going to prioritize this population, as well as some money to the Water Development Board for technical assistance to help those communities access that funding. There is also priority for projects with completed permitting. To be honest, there's not a whole lot of this. It's more of a thing in other infrastructure groups, but less so in water. The public awareness campaign, very important to help people understand the importance of water. I read all the time about some communities that don't even have, for example, a tiered rate system, right? And so that means that they can continue to use as much water as they want without paying more at the higher levels. And what you typically see to make people a little bit more conservation minded is that, because water is a human right, you have a certain like first tier that everybody gets, and then as you use more water, you pay more for that water. That's not necessarily the case in all communities in Texas, and so that sort of goes, making people aware of that is going to be really important, and that ties into the conservation and the water loss funding. So water line breaks are something that we have seen an enormous increase in as the amount of extreme weather that has hit Texas has continued to increase. So whether it's floods or freezes or droughts, the soil actually expands and contracts, and that breaks lines, which leads to the number of boil water notices that Julie mentioned earlier. And then there is a provision that requires that 25% of that $1 billion go into the new water supply fund. And the new water supply fund is focused on new water. So the way that the the law actually defines what new water is that it includes desalination, which is both ocean and brackish groundwater, which is salty water from the aquifer, not quite as salty as you would see in the sea. Aquifer storage and recovery, that's essentially where you're taking surplus water in times of plenty, you put it down in the aquifer in certain places where it's conducive, and then whenever you hit a drought, then you're able to bring that back up without the risk of storing it in something like a reservoir where it's subject to evaporation. There are some statistics out right now, because there's a lot of focus on evaporation, that is saying that the state roughly loses about as much water to evaporation as we use in the state, which is an incredible number. Produced water, so that is when the oil and gas companies are putting their secret sauce of chemicals and such down into the aquifer to frack and to get that oil and gas, that you have 7 to 9 barrels of water that come up with that oil. And so the oil and gas companies are really struggling to know what to do with this, because the number of injection wells, the Railroad Commission has largely stopped approving additional permits for that. So they've got to figure out a place to put all this produced water. And we also have a water need in the state. So there are some, innovative companies that are really looking at how can we take advantage of this and treat produced water to the point that we can make it a beneficial use for various purposes. And then, of course, transport of that water. Now, the thing about this new water, and mind you, we have TWCA has a lot of members of the more traditional water districts and entities, and they have to be really sensitive to what their ratepayers can sustain. And so these are not necessarily the projects that are most commonly implemented. And the reason why is, first, they are more innovative, but they're also more expensive. And so there is going to be a limit to which the ratepayers will not be able to sustain this. Now, in some communities, it's going to be a bit more affordable. You don't have to pipe it as far. I know that there are a couple of different applications for desalination here in Corpus Christi. And so that's really great too, because if you're able to use desal here on the coast, that might also allow you to free up some of that fresh water upstream. So it can have advantages that aren't just centered on where that desalination plant is. So it's something that continues the economic feasibility of those projects continues to be more accessible. This funding is intended to help sort of provide more access to those types of technologies. But it really raised an interesting policy question. So if you're a policy wonk like me, you're walking around the session like, what is new water? And there's a whole lot of opinions about what it really is. Well, this slide essentially walks you through the different versions of it. And what was really sort of up for debate was in the Senate, they really focused a lot on getting water from other states. So Louisiana has a whole lot of water. Arkansas has some water. So there are some ongoing conversations still with those states to see if they are willing to sell that water. I'm not sure how far that will get, but I'm not specifically involved in those negotiations. When the bill went over to the House, they had a bit of a broader interpretation of what new water might mean. And we were very supportive of these. So that's where aquifer storage and recovery was added, but they also added direct reuse. And that was not specifically defined, but would have included direct potable reuse, which is essentially toilet to tap, right? You use the wastewater, you treat it, and then you put it right back in the system to be used as drinking water instead of putting it, traditionally in a river, and the next town downstream picks it up and treats it. So just more direct there. But that was pulled out in the conference committee and ultimately did not pass. And the water from other states was pulled out in the House. So you're left with what you see on the right side of the screen there, which is the 3 items plus the transport of those items in new water. But the reason these conversations were interesting in this sort of evolution of what this term means is because for many people, we were asking, okay, well, when you talk about new, it's new to who? Are we talking about the utility that Julie's running? Are we talking about new to anyone? Are we talking about only for municipal use? If it's new, for example, produced water, is it new water if you're reusing it for oil and gas use? Well, there's a lot of different questions that kept coming up. Now, from our chairman's perspective, he wrote a letter, and I'll show you a bit of that in a second, but he put the definition in his letter that you see at the bottom of the screen, which I'll read to you, is that it is not currently used for a beneficial purpose or currently unavailable for such use in Texas due to water quality issues, technological incapabilities, or the location of its source, and would, if introduced for beneficial use, add to the net total volume of water supply available to Texans. So he's really talking about new molecules that we aren't including in our current water supply planning. And Chairman Perry wrote a letter to the Water Development Board to inform them as they're considering rulemaking on the new water supply in the Texas Water Fund. And so we expect that rulemaking will take place this fall, and at least some of the funding awards from that $1 billion will start flowing out to communities as well. But he really is just trying to get us also to think bigger about when we think about water. So as we have regional water planning process, it's really great from a community perspective because you're able to vet those projects as it goes upwards to the state. But what we're missing out on are really big projects that are going to need to have some sort of state direction and state planning. So we're starting to have a realization that probably we need to have both of those conversations going at once, because the size and the cost of the kinds of projects that we're really going to need to solve our biggest water supply issues are going to be bigger than any one region. And so that's the kind of conversations that I expect to continue into the next session. And before I leave, I just want to be clear that despite getting the $1 billion, water infrastructure is an ongoing conversation, especially within the water community. Some of these graphics here are from the materials that the water groups had put together, and actually Julie's group helped put together for us as we were going through the session and advocating for additional state investment in water infrastructure. But the water plan needs, this chart is going to be a real doozy when we have the next one come out in 2027, because these 2022 water plan numbers are based in 2018. That's pre-pandemic. And if anybody has watched their grocery bill or bought anything, you know the cost of everything has doubled to triple. And especially that's true in water projects. So we anticipate that number is going to be through the roof, and we're very anxious about it. Financial assistance programs, of course, oversubscribed. We don't have enough money to hand out to all the communities that are interested. And we have a lot of boil water notices, a lot of poor rankings in terms of the state of our infrastructure, and the amount of federal money that's coming to help us is really on the decrease.
And moving on from just the detailed perspective and kind of looking at how our 88th went. Well, we had a regular session, which is, of course, the 140 days. And on that final day, sine die, the governor called a special session, and so our legislators did not have a break at all. And special sessions are special because they are for a discrete amount of time, 30 days, and really, focused on whatever the governor, whatever his discretion is. And the first special session was really looking at property tax reform with a smattering of border security. And the House passed a property tax reform bill on the 30th, on May 30th, and then adjourned. So the House said, all right, here you go, Senate. We're out. We need a break. And so first special session ended without the priority bill that Governor Abbott needed to see. So we moved on into the second special session looking at property tax reform. And I will add that there was some, it's really interesting when the big three don't necessarily agree on things. And when I talk about the big three, I mean our governor, our lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House. And while they're all from the same party, their views on these particular issues in the special session were pretty divergent. And the lieutenant governor had his own bill in mind for property tax relief, and Abbott ended up really choosing the path of the Speaker of the House's bill. And so, infighting all over the place, even though they are of all the same party. So, second special session rolled around in June. Property tax reform was finally passed, but there is no rest for the weary. The third special session was called in October to look at school choice, which were the voucher bills, of course, that Governor Abbott was pushing very hard to have passed. And that was one of his priorities, Lieutenant Governor's priorities. And so we knew that that was going to be addressed in the special session. And Governor Abbott said, that this is one of his top issues, and he was not going to let it go. And were not passed in the third. And so then we rolled into the fourth that started on November 7th. So at this point, our legislators had gone through the election cycle in November of the preceding year, the 140 days of the session, through these marathon special sessions, and rolled into the fourth. And the voucher bill was not passed. In fact, at the 11th hour, there was an amendment tagged on to the bill that was floating around, and that amendment stripped the bill of the money necessary to actually, if passed, the intent of the bill would not have been seen, and money would not have flowed in the right direction to really satisfy the governor. So, fourth special session ended without school choice or the voucher bill passed, and that really spelled some pretty huge political divisions that were already there, but that really, I guess, cast them in stone. And out of those special sessions, well, I guess coupled with those special sessions were also another series of firsts. So we have, again, the four special sessions. So our lawmakers were in session for more days in the 88th than any other year since the legislature was convened in 1846. So it was again a very exceptional year. We saw the House impeachment of the Attorney General Ken Paxton and the Senate acquittal, and the House impeachment saw 121 of the House vote to impeach, and I believe it was something like 23 or so voted to acquit, and then a few were not there, and so forth and so on. Then, of course, the Senate acquittal and the unanimous expulsion of Representative Brian Slayton, who was a first-year lawmaker. And again, we've talked a little bit about the political divisions, and when you have any unanimous support of one single issue or one single idea in either side of the legislature, that's a pretty big deal. So again, a lot of contentious issues, a lot of time spent debating these contentious issues, and that really showed. And so I have this slide up here because my organization has kind of a rotating door of really awesome interns who are super young and throw words like vibe around. And so, what was the vibe at the legislature? It was bad, y'all. Like it was tough. Exhausted legislators for those reasons that I listed before, those contentious issues. And those all really dovetailed into heated primary races. So we knew, and it was not. Let me rephrase this. It was spoken. It was said out loud that Governor Abbott and would be gunning after those lawmakers that did not vote for school vouchers. And that's just how the politics are played. And so a number of Republicans banded together with Democrats to really block that school choice bill. And we saw a ton of money poured into Republican challengers in the primary races to unseat some of those Republicans that did not push for school vouchers. And again, that's just how the game is played, and that was the outcome. And so looking at those contentious Republican primaries and runoffs, the most contentious was Speaker of the House, Dave Phelan, and he retained his House seat by 366 votes out of 25,000 plus cast. And so he did retain his seat, and so did Gary Van Dever. But the rest of the House Republicans that were in primary races lost. And a big reason for that was that they got crossways with the governor and lieutenant governor on certain issues, including school choice.
And the attorney general too,
Oh.
as sort of a revenge tour for voting to impeach him in the House.
Absolutely, absolutely. And next slide. Now we go into the great water loss, which is kind of the fallout, again, of those exhausted legislators. Some chose not to seek reelection because they were just so tapped and exhausted. And then, of course, others lost their primary race. And so we're going to take a deeper dive into that. And of course, Tracy O. King, Chairman King, who led that House Water Caucus that we talked about, he is not seeking reelection. I know that his water work is near and dear to many of your hearts here in this room. And so it's a tough loss for us in the Texas legislature. I know it's a tough loss for you all locally. And he really was the one that pushed hard and pushed hard for a more robust Texas Water Fund, and then also for that pristine waters bill. I know he led that, and we worked with him as well. And so we have For Price, who declined to run for an 8th term in the Texas House. And of course, For Price was part of that group of Republicans that banded together that helped block that school choice bill. And he also voted to impeach Kim Paxton. And then we have Ed Thompson, who was one of that group of 21 Republicans who blocked the voucher bill. He chose not to run. Kyle Casal, who also blocked the voucher bill, chose not to run. Andrew Murr, who actually led the House impeachment of Kim Paxton and really fell on his sword, making an impassioned speech on the House floor, of course, chose not to run. And his quote, I think, is pretty spectacular. He didn't mention any of the kind of background politics that were going on, and he's a farmer, and he said, literally, the cows are calling me home. I've spent enough time up here. It's time for me to go back to the farm, and the cows are calling me home. And Drew Springer, I think that's a fantastic picture of an exhausted individual that if you take a look at that picture and said, hey, is that guy going to run for reelection next year? You would say no, and you're right. And he's, of course, in the Senate, and he had a tough year.
I think those of us who are working closely with the legislature are going through the various stages of grief through this major loss. It's a tough one.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we'll jump into remember those names and those pictures that we just looked at. Well, let's take a look at how many of those we are losing from the House Natural Resources Committee, the top 2. 4 total. Stan Kitzman had a challenger in the primary. He held on to his seat. So again, great water loss. House Environmental Reg also hears water bills. And Senate, again, some loss here. Okay.
Right. Starting to talk just about what they're working on, the meat of the work during this interim. You can see here that the Senate interim charges are very light, but very broad. And I think part of what you're seeing here is just because of that exhaustion and the fact that they've been at the Capitol so much during the interim. I think that in some cases there's not a lot of appetite to take on a whole lot during this interim. But the Senate is already underway. This water system reliability charge, like I said, water system reliability, you can really tie almost anything into this charge, and so it gives them a great deal of flexibility. They'll also be monitoring legislation from last session. but they've already started some hearings. So in May, we had a couple of panels. Water supply, there was 3 different panels on this, and it's interesting because they went through the statistics of our supply challenges, then desalination, and then produced water. So you can see the chairman's still very, very, very focused on new water at this point. Conversations about water infrastructure, we testified on that one. Water workforce and cybersecurity were top of mind. And then they're going to come back in September and talk about a couple other things, which are going to include small system consolidation and regionalization, which is a huge topic, especially with some of the unchecked growth that's surrounding some of our bigger fast growth areas, interagency cooperation, and then, of course, their monitoring.
And I will note, Sarah said it in passing, but she did testify on the panel, and she did a great job. So their group is really on the forefront of providing that voice of the Coalition of Water Organizations on water infrastructure. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. And then we're also going to have a conversation just in the finance perspective about implementation of Senate Bill 28, which is the Texas Water Fund. The House has also released its interim charges, and there's a little bit more meat here. So first, they'll be monitoring past legislation. There's a specific call out for Senate Bill 28, again, making sure that the water fund is working as intended. Reliability of clean water access. These are some interesting words, but all the language in that charge is really looking at boil water notices and the dramatic increase in boil water notices to make sure that, kind of some of the language actually reminded me of things that we saw after Winter Storm Uri when there were so many service disruptions. But in parts of the state, the number of boil water notices are exceedingly high. Water reuse, again, having some more conversations about that was not included in Senate Bill 28, but it is a new one that we want to see adopted in more areas, especially as our water supply becomes more scarce. And groundwater infrastructure is really focused on the data and the science to support how much groundwater do we have, how accessible is it, and where is it accessible, and what are those implications. So I want to talk a little bit about TWCA and our interim process. So because of the diverse interests within TWCA, we have a pretty democratic process that we work through in the interim where our members sort of toss in a whole bunch of ideas about things that they'd like to see changed in state law, and then we talk about them, and then we vote, and the top vote getters, we form subcommittees to try and work through some of those gnarly interests before we get to the session, before our members start going at each other's throats to try and facilitate some consensus. But we have a very high consensus threshold, 90%. So that means that not a whole lot comes out, but when it comes out, it's bulletproof. There may be 1 or 2 people that oppose it, but we can explain who they are and what their interests are. And so those bills are largely bulletproof at the Capitol. That also means that we spend a whole lot of time during the session educating members on the different perspectives on some of these controversial issues. Because I guess because of the diverse nature of our membership, the issues that we end up taking up also tend to be the issues that you see in large part come up during the session. So this interim, we're working on 5 different topics. The first is water infrastructure. We'll be talking both about the additional need for state investment in water infrastructure. And by water, I mean water, wastewater, and flood. We mean that in the broadest sense. We'll also be talking about financial assistance programs, gaps in those programs, and ways that we can be strengthening those to address them. We'll also be talking about groundwater permitting. So there is a case that's prompting some of this discussion called Aqua Texas, which is an IOU in Hays County that has a groundwater permit and pumped double the amount that their groundwater permit allows them to pump. So there's litigation in multiple directions on this case. What we'll be talking about on this subcommittee is whether or not groundwater conservation districts have the right tools in the toolbox to be able to deal with people who go over and above their permitted amount. So if you allow folks to pump water beyond what they're permitted to do, it really calls into question our entire groundwater management scheme. So it's a real big charge. They're also going to be talking about some really big permits that are coming through because groundwater districts really feel like they have no choice but to say yes to every permit that comes through. And that's because groundwater is a private property right. And so they can't tell somebody no because they have the right to access that groundwater. What they end up doing is, in some cases, awarding them less groundwater than they're asking for. But in a lot of situations, GCDs are approving these massive permits through with the idea that let everybody in the door, but then you're going to give them all haircuts whenever we start to run out of water, which maybe isn't the best approach, but that's what we're doing right now. So we're going to have conversations about that approach versus maybe are there options to curb people on the front end to make the resource last a little bit longer and what those trade-offs are. We'll be talking about drought contingency plans. This is kind of the other side of that Aqua Texas case, because with IOUs, these are privately operated water utilities. Through their regulation with the Public Utility Commission, they are required to provide adequate service, and they can get in trouble if they do not do that. And so they are saying we aren't even allowed to implement drought contingency plans, and we had to pump double the amount of water from the district that we were allowed because PUC requires us to provide this service to our customers. So there are some gray areas in what they call the tariff, which is like the ability for IOUs to operate and provide water service. So we're going to talk about that because we think that as water supply continues to dwindle, that it's every utility needs to have the ability to implement drought contingency plans. Might be talking about some of the rate structure issues that I mentioned earlier. So again, tools in the toolbox kind of conversation there. The definition of waste, this is one that's incredibly controversial. So the surface water statutes and the groundwater statutes have different definitions of what a beneficial use is versus a waste of water. And so because they both developed in sort of a different worlds at different times, I think we need some resolution of those two, conflicting statutes. There are also some issues buried in that in terms of some surface water interests that are looking to pump groundwater and then put it in the river and pick it up later to treat it. Groundwater interests, of course, when groundwater comes out of the ground, for the most part, it's in pretty good condition. You don't really need to spend a lot of money to treat it. So putting it in a dirty river is super cheap to move it around, and that's why they want to do it. But it also means you have to treat it. And so they think that that's wasteful. So there's some tension there, and the use of vanity ponds. So when you see all these big new developments, a lot of times they'll have a fountain or some, pretty pond at the entrance to make it aesthetically appealing. A lot of times they're pumping groundwater in to make sure that those are full. And so some groundwater districts are enforcing against those developers, and they're calling that wasteful. So again, one that we're going to have some conversations about, but I don't anticipate getting to consensus. And then we're going to talk about domestic and livestock reservoir exemptions. So in the hill country area, there's been a huge proliferation of these tanks. And I think what it is you're seeing some big farms subdivide as families are sort of breaking up, and you're not having kids continue to do agriculture in those areas. And as they do that, you're seeing more and more stock ponds. Like everybody wants their private little ski pond. And so we have a lot of questions about whether or not the rules that are in law are tight enough, whether landowners are educated enough on what they can and can't do with that water. And so we'll have those conversations. And of course, we have both the Farm Bureau and LCRA, a river authority, as the co-chairs, because what we typically do is take people on different sides of an issue and make them the chair so that we don't have any sort of bias in our process. Right, Julie?
Great. And WEAT Interim Watch will, of course, really focus on the House Natural Resources Committee reuse expansion charge. And so we're excited to see that because, like Sarah said, reuse did not make it into the definition of new water, as that definition was tailor-made to fit, of course, as she said, new molecules into that 7 million acre feet. So looking to see how we can expand reuse through the addition of purple pipe, potable and direct potable reuse. And Senate Water Ag Rural Affairs, of course, every committee is charged with really focusing on how the previous session's legislation is being implemented. And so with Senate Water Ag, we're looking at, of course, Senate Bill 28, and that is the Texas Water Fund bill. And we're looking at how Texas Water Development Board ends up dispersing that money and making sure that that process allows wastewater to get a piece of that funding. And of course, that's something that we're we continue to focus on. As we talk about nutrients and the expense and the capital improvement projects necessary to fund nutrient treatment to a level that maintains the stream quality. That's an incredible expense, and it's a capital improvement expense that our utilities and our entities need to forecast many years, 5-10 years in advance, to be able to get that funding, secure that funding to implement that. And so when we look at the Texas Water Fund, note that that funding that's being pushed out, it is really dedicated to drinking water. And we do have funding coming in through the Clean Water SRFs, but as a lot of y'all know, that Clean Water SRF, the only way that wastewater entities can grab at that is if they're in noncompliance. And so what we want to do is continue to look at Senate Bill 28, continue to look at water infrastructure, and really push for, I guess, a more robust funding mechanism that allows a greater pool of money, a greater funding dedicated source to wastewater. Because as we know, we cannot fund those nutrient removal technologies through our utilities, without dedicated funding for wastewater. And Senate Bill 1289, another reuse bill filed by Perry, and that is for on-site reuse, and that's the Blackwater reuse bill that was really pushed by a couple of folks and a group in Austin that wanted to do on-site reuse. So we're excited to see that and see how that can expand across the state.
One other thing I'd like to mention, just because it's certainly relevant coming down here and seeing all of the flooding, is the Water Development Board is in the process of working up the first state flood plan. And so after Hurricane Harvey, the legislature tasked the board with essentially replicating the water supply planning process for flood planning. So it's on a regional basis, and the first plan has been out for public comment. And so we'll be watching that. For sure, there's a series of legislative recommendations in there that largely came up from the local regions. There has been testimony from the building and development community. They aren't big fans of a lot of those recommendations because as you put more restrictions on where and how you can build, that means that the cost of housing also goes up. So there's kind of that tension between the cost and the desire for affordable housing, while also make sure that we're doing things that promote safety and save lives in flood-prone areas.
And fantastic. All right. Moving into the 89th, just to give you a snapshot of those key dates to keep in mind. November 5th, Election Day. And I think everyone probably has that on their calendar. November 11th is the first day of pre-filing. And so that November 11th date, it's not included in the 140 days of the session, but that's where you see those high priority bills start to pop out. So when we say high priority bills, think of the low numbered bills that you see in the House and the Senate. And the very first day of the 89th is January 14th. Everyone star that and circle it. And bill filing deadline. So what's popped out of the hopper and UC file, that's got to be out by March 14th. And then, of course, moving on to sine die, the final day, and the veto deadline, June 22nd. So those are all the big dates to remember as we move into the 89th. And big three, I think we talked a little bit about this earlier. Really, the tone and tenor of the session is determined by how these three individuals, and of course those individuals can change, but those three positions interact with each other. And so, notably, we talked a little bit about the Speaker of the House only retaining his seat in the primary runoff by 366 votes. So we know that he's going to have a tough battle to retain that Speaker position. And he has, lost, I think, some lieutenant support in the process, but he was, of course, one of the thinkers behind the fifth and behind a lot of the flood planning coming out of Hurricane Harvey. And so we certainly do not want to lose his water thinking in the key position. And those big three, whomever they may be, they'll be looking at the budget surplus. We will, or at least Governor Abbott said that we will enjoy a budget surplus again next session, next year. And so we don't know what that number is, but we certainly hope to see it soon. Property taxes will be another issue, border security. And of course, we talked a lot about school choice education and voucher program. That will pop back up without a doubt. Electrical grid, and then it is Texas, so we will see a fair amount of the air in the room being taken up by social and cultural issues as well.
I'll add just on the money piece, this conversation about having a surplus and then, their desire to reduce the reliance of the state on property taxes. This plays into our water infrastructure efforts because we're certainly having conversations about it would be really nice to have a dedicated revenue source for water infrastructure like you see for transportation, for example. I'm not sure how feasible that's going to be in terms of a dedicated source when you start looking at some of the other models and sales tax and such. If our leadership is really that dedicated to reducing our reliance on property taxes, that makes it of utmost concern that we have a very steady sales tax coming in, which is already our largest tax supply here in the state. So I think that that's going to play into conversations about water infrastructure in terms of a dedicated source versus maybe a one-time investment if we're able to have any traction there. And then I also want to point out on the electrical grid, there was an interesting article in the Texas Tribune yesterday that they changed the definition to where instead of just counting people asking to connect to the grid, they can include folks who are in the planning stages of wanting to ask to connect to the grid. And it's looking like our electrical demand could double in 6 years, which is pretty fast, friends, right? And so certainly on the water front, there's a connection there between energy and water. We have to be mindful of that. A lot of these folks who are coming online that expect to tap into the grid also expect to tap into our water systems. And so I'm hoping that maybe that conversation is broad enough to include all of the aspects of what we'll be talking about. And just thinking through next session, leadership challenges. Julie's already mentioned this in terms of Speaker Phelan did retain his seat, but whether or not he can retain his speakership is something that is up for debate. There are 2 challengers already to that, so there will be a speaker race in some form or fashion. And so time will tell whether he's able to hold on to that. But we do expect more division. And as we had so many of the more moderate, especially Republicans who are in the leadership position right now, retire or lose their seats, you have a lot more extreme. And there's extreme on both sides of the aisle, of course, but this is going to create more division. And it's going to, in my opinion, make the Texas legislature move a lot closer to what you see in Congress. So Texas legislature, despite the division and they really do get a lot done. Julie was talking about, we actually had the highest passage rate ever by this tiniest amounts. It's pretty close to normal, 16%, but we're still getting stuff done despite all of the fights that we have and despite how many ideas die, especially towards the end of the session. Now, as we move to a place where that division gets even worse, I can see us ending up a lot closer to Congress where we're getting less and less done, and that's not good for anybody. So that's on the list of Sarah Kirkle's fears here. But in terms of water, Chairman Perry in the Senate has been very clear that we're going to be having a conversation about water supply. And as you know, he is very focused on new water. And we are focused on trying to make sure that conversation is broad enough to capture everybody's needs and not just these newer ideas. So that will be a big topic and a big focus for us during the session. And water infrastructure funding, of course, is a big question mark. We do not have an interim charge to say, look at the funding of this like they do for electricity. And so we're wondering, whether or not there is full leadership support for additional investment in water infrastructure. So that's something that we're going to continue to work through and raise the alarms on. But I don't know if it's going to be our session. Other thoughts, Julie?
Thanks, Sarah. A good rule of thumb is always to look at the interim charges. Those usually tell us which way the wind is blowing. And so we did see water supply. We saw an emphasis on Senate Bill 28. And so, I think infrastructure funding, water supply will still be part of that conversation. And hopefully we'll see funding loosened up for the water availability models as well.
So to close, we just want to make sure everybody sees our pups.
Yep. So the Texas legislature is sometimes pretty heavy. And so I like to end presentations with pictures of my dogs because they are light and fluffy and adorable and leave you with a really, really warm heart. And so Mary is on the left side of your screen. She's a Pekingese mix. We did have her DNA test, and she has a little bit of Shih Tzu in her, but mostly Pekingese. We have a super mutt on the right, Spencer. He has given you his best give me a treat eye, and he is a little bit of a poodle, little bit of a Alaskan husky mix, and a lot of snuggly love.
And I've got 2 German short hair pointers. That's Murphy on the top and Shotzi on the bottom. And at the top of the tree, there's a lizard that they're chasing because they are always chasing and hunting something. And anyway, it keeps our life very interesting. So thanks. Any questions?
All right, I have a couple of questions from the audience so far. Do you believe that a second water fund bill will occur in the next session?
Oof. All right. Well, I'm going to start with that one and say we hope to have a conversation about water funding. We hope that conversation is robust. You know, internally, when Sarah and I and the water groups were talking about Senate Bill 28, a lot of what we said was like, we got to get as much money in this Senate Bill 28 because we know that there will be the thinking of, well, we've done something about water, so we don't need to do anything more for another 10 years or so. But again, whenever we say that we don't think it's going to be a water session, it's a water session in Texas.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we are going to be having a water supply conversation, and Chairman Perry is going to have to find a way to fund that, fund his plan. So I think in my mind, we're going to have some conversation about funding, whether that is specific to new water versus the full range of infrastructure needs. I think that's my biggest question.
So with water quality and wastewater seems to be managed very decentralized in the state of Texas, are there any efforts to maybe centralize planning such as the regional water planning groups and the regional flood planning groups to handle water quality and wastewater?
I would love to see that. We've been talking about this for some time. Travis, you and I, and then with Nathan as well. Regionalization is really the direction that we need to move in. I will say that there's not an appetite to talk about wastewater ever, anywhere, especially the legislature. No one wants to talk about wastewater. Wastewater is not sexy, as it's often said and widely known. And so it's just a difficult conversation to have. You know, and jokingly, I've been talking about, hey, we need a state wastewater plan, you know, or a state clean water plan. We've got one for drinking water. We've got one for flood now. Where's wastewater? And in fact, that $1 billion, that's not loosened up to direct at wastewater. Again, it's not interesting to talk about. It's not well funded. But man, you know, are we reliant on those return flows? And are we reliant on how well that wastewater is treated to determine our water supply treatment levels? So it's an important component that we just don't like to talk about.
Yeah, I'll just add that typically when you see the state make that significant of an investment, it's in reaction to a crisis. So we got the water supply planning process after an incredible drought. We got the flood planning process after Hurricane Harvey. I'm not sure what kind of crisis would take to get there.
And frankly, you know, we don't want to see that kind of crisis with over 3,000 major SSOs that were reported in the state of Texas last year. And 4 Texas cities under consent decree. You know, what else do we have to see, right? There's no other state with more than 1 city under a wastewater consent decree, and we've got 4.
We got time for maybe one more question from the audience.
Hey.
First off, I want to thank you 2 young ladies and your organizations for work well done. So I heard you. So a key thing about legislative intent, and you touched on it, that both chairmen made a point about regarding new water, is their interest in looking at large projects with a regional impact. And I'd like to stress on that includes rural communities, that a regional approach, you get efficiencies of scale that can make those new sources of water more affordable for rural communities. And so I think they felt both very strong about that we need to go big to be able to have a major impact. A question I've got, though, there was this debate about bringing water from other areas. People were thinking Louisiana. We're hopeful that that will also include, especially along the coast, to be able to move potential sources of water between water planning districts and basins, because a larger regional approach may involve regions cooperating on that. And what's your thoughts on that?
I think as we have these conversations about these interregional projects, there's this interesting presentation. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to pass it along, from several years ago about, I mean, we have had conversations about moving Western water from across states. I mean, there have been plans to move it from Canada down into California. There's plans and conversations right now about moving seawater from the coast over to Arizona, because there are plans to get it from down below into the Gulf of Mexico aren't working out. So all these big ideas, everything that is old is new again. And so I think these conversations, there are plans already that have been essentially shelved. So Trans-Texas reports from the mid-90s have exactly these plans that you're laying out, Mark. And I'm glad you brought this up, because in the rural community piece, I just want to stress that one of my big concerns is I check my Google alerts on Texas Water every day, and there are small towns that are not participating in the water planning process, that don't understand the lack of reliability of their water supply, especially if they're on groundwater, and I'm very concerned about that. But the water planning process, it may have some faults, but it's where you have that collaboration happen. And there's not really local solutions anymore. You're not going to be able in your tiny town to go next door and just put in a well field and access that water. Collaboration and regionalization is not an option. It is a requirement now, because all of the easy, cheap water has already been developed. So the only thing left are these big projects that are interregional and very expensive. And so in order to make it cost effective for everyone, we have to participate in a regional way and collaborate in order to achieve those solutions.
Thank you so much, ladies. If you guys aren't a part of WEAT or TWCA for your cities and organizations, counties, please join them. I've spent a lot of time in Austin fighting for stuff, and these two ladies fight harder than you would ever imagine for you guys to have funding and water rights and just everything. They are a fantastic group. I cannot commend them enough. Thank y'all so much for everything y'all do for us.